Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 705 for the 10th of April 2022. Richard Saunders coming to you from a sunny Sydney, Australia. We've had so much rain recently that when it does rain, just a moderate shower, there's flooding straight away because the ground is saturated. But you don't want to hear about saturated ground. You want to hear about what's coming up on this week's episode of the Skeptic Zone. We're going to kick off. We're going to start with an interview I conducted in the last week with a very interesting fellow indeed, Bob Swanson. Now, Bob is from the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Mississippi State University. Now, why am I talking to Bob? Well, he has done a series of videos about critical thinking, and one of them revolves around the claims of power balance, the old wristbands. Increase your balance, your strength, and your flexibility. And he looks at this claim from a critical point of view and a physics point of view and sort of deconstructs what's happening in those classic famous sham, as we know now, sham tests. It's great to know that after all these years that I was investigating the power balance over 10 years now, 10 years ago, that the lessons are still being learnt and used, or used and learnt. Anyway, coming up at the top of the show, interview with Bob Swanson, and I will link to his series of critical thinking videos. Following that, it's the Australian Skeptics newsletter, read once again with elegance and poise by Adrian Hill in Canada. Of course, it all makes sense. Of course, the Australian Skeptics newsletter should be read from Canada, I think. Then it's Tim Mendham back with a book of Tim and an item about the history of astrology and astronomy. And this is called An Eye to the Sky, written by Tim Harding. So Tim Mendham bringing you that report a bit later on in the Book of Tim. Then to round off the show, it's a dive into the Trove archives once again, and staying with our astrology theme from Tim Mendham, we're going to wander through the digital archives and look at references here in Australia to the oldie but goldie, the evergreen, the thing that won't go away, astrology. I noticed that in this state, in New South Wales and Victoria too, and I think other states, I'm not sure, it's holiday time for school students, which is lots of fun for my nieces and nephews. And it's also holiday time, well, as much as they can have a holiday for the teachers out there, the teachers who have just started their little break. Good luck to you. I'm thinking about you because I know what a difficult job teaching really is. I think you deserve all the breaks you can get. So to all my teacher friends out there, hopefully putting their feet up with a cat on the lap, I'm thinking about you. Have a nice break. Stay tuned at the end of the episode for another announcement from me. But now it's time for me to run downstairs. And without a question, it's a poached egg on toast sort of day. Why, I go and enjoy that. I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. And joining me now, all the way from the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Mississippi State University. Oh, I'd like to visit that campus, I really would. It's Bob Swanson. Hello, Bob.
Hello, Richard. Nice to see you.
Yes, nice to see you too. Of course, these days it's great to video people. You were just talking to me before we went on air about you asking me what it's like to live in the future. And sometimes when I think how easy it is to video people from around the world, that you and I are both now living in the future, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I've always valued living I've lived a university life, working at universities, and I've always valued the fact that you get a chance to, especially in the science department, meet people from all around the world. Many times the faculty or the TAs are, it's an international, kind of thing. And now that we're Zooming, it's so nice to be able to touch base with folks, halfway around the world,
really
so
is.
easily.
It's fantastic. Now, why am I talking to you? Well, you heard me having a chat on another podcast. Was that the Atheist Experience? I think that was.
Correct.
Yes, I was
correct.
on there with my friend Rob Palmer to talk about the Great Australian Psychic Prediction Project. You heard that, and your interest was piqued because, and it's a bit of a story here, folks. It's a bit of a tangled web. But you have done a series of videos I'd like to chat to you about critical thinking. And why this all ties in is, I think, one of the first ones, if not the first one, was concentrating on the good old power balance wristband from 2009, 2010 era.
Exactly.
And I was delighted when you contacted me, and I had a look at your videos and I thought, wow, look at that, because you brought up some interesting insights that I'd never thought about. But let's get back to basics. Why did you start doing this, and why did you concentrate on the power balance and the claims of the power balance wristband?
Right. I'll give you kind of a brief biography in the sense that I've been a teacher twice. I started out in the mid-90s out of college as a high school science teacher. Did that for a couple of years, left it, went back to graduate school, got a degree in meteorology, and I spent a decade as a meteorologist. Then around 2010, I came back to teaching, moved to Mississippi and got into teaching, and I was teaching at a community college. And the very first semester I was teaching was when power balance bands were all the rage. And I was teaching a physical science class. This is a conceptual physics class. It's kind of physics for non-science majors. So a lot of the math is stripped away. It's really just students are there to get a science credit. Quite often, these are students who have not been turned on. There's a reason why they're not science majors in college, because they weren't inspired in high school. And so they've gone or maybe they've got a passion for history or whatever, but they're taking my class. And I had a couple of students who are wearing these power balance bands.
Yeah.
And they wanted to know, do they really work? And I first of all I was kind of caught flat-footed because I'd never seen them before. So they did the demonstrations for me, and I thought that was interesting. And then pretty soon I started to notice that there were flyers up on campus. People were selling these things. And I thought, well, yeah, I started to notice them on people's wrists more, I'm sure as well. I thought, I need to address this. And so I actually started to investigate them. And that's actually when I stumbled across there's a TV report that you were part of. So that's where you first hit my radar screen, because you were part of my research in trying to figure these things out. And that's why I was so delighted when you recently appeared on the Atheist Experience with Seth Andrews, and heard your voice, and I thought, wow, 10 years on, he's still doing his thing.
I haven't quit. Yes, you saw these things on campus. You decided at some stage or other to do a critical thinking course, which you've put on YouTube. Now, what was your approach? How did you manage to weave in the power balance into your critical thinking videos?
Yeah, the original version of it, I just thought the students, they came to me asking for my explanation. They looked at me as the physicist to explain this phenomenon. And, they seemed sincere, and I thought it was interesting. The more I looked into it, I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And I'd never really, probed the psychology of it. For me, it was just trying to answer a physics question and teach a little bit about torque and that sort of thing.
Yes.
But I think the original version of the video was much more straight, kind of physics. But then when I found your report, where it was the double-blind experiment, I thought this is really a good way of, talking about what's the difference between a demonstration versus an experiment.
Yes.
And then when I actually took video of my students doing it, and doing these tests on each other, these demonstrations on each other, and of course they weren't in it for the money. They weren't themselves profiting from these. It really was a good example of the psychology of it. When you are expecting a result, it will subconsciously affect the way you do the test.
Yeah.
So that's why the double blind was so really so important, and really a good example, way of really bring this home to my students.
That's great, because it's a classic. It set itself up so well for a double-blind test because it's a straightforward claim. Wear this device, and this will happen, and this will happen. Your balance and your strength and your flexibility will increase. Don't wear it, and you'll have less balance, less strength, less flexibility. And I, like you, I noticed that on the promotional videos, and in your video, you reference one of these promotional videos. It's blindingly obvious that, of course, both the person doing the test and the person undergoing the test both know when or when not the band is in use. So
Right.
my approach was, well, it's simple. Let's just take that out of the equation. If it works, it would work regardless of whether the people knew this device was around. And that was my thinking at the time. And, well, the results were quite obvious. But I really enjoyed watching your video about this because I learned some interesting physics. Can you talk briefly about a couple of things, the center of gravity, the direction of force, and torque and moment arm, which I found were fascinating?
Right. I usually explain moment arm and torque to my students by just opening a door.
Mm-hmm.
You grab the door handle, and I talk about, how easy is it to open a door? Pretty easy. And which direction are you applying your force? You're applying your force perpendicular to the actual door itself. So you're producing rotation of the door around the hinges.
Yeah.
But it's a whole lot easier when you do it far out on the door, as opposed to if you're trying to push right next to the hinges.
Yes.
You don't get nearly the leverage. And of course, a lot of students are, even at that point, pretty familiar with leverage. But this is a good way of introducing torque and rotational motion and that sort of thing. And that really is, folks can watch the video in its entirety. But that's really the key, is that depending on how you apply your force on a test subject in doing the power balance bands, just a small force that's perpendicular to their moment arm will cause them to rotate. If you're pushing parallel to their moment arm, you cause no rotation. Just like if you were to pull on a door, or push on a door, toward the hinges or away from the hinges, the door doesn't move, it doesn't rotate either. But when you just push perpendicular, you cause rotation. And that's really, I think, the physics at the heart of the power balance demonstrations.
Absolutely. And in your video, which I'll reference to, folks, if you want to check out Bob's video, I'll be adding a link in this week's show notes. So it's fantastic for me because, for all these years, I knew what was going on. I knew it was the direction of the force applied to the arm towards or away from the center of gravity was really where it's the heart of the trick. But I was really grateful to have it explained to me with all these extra things like the torque and the moment arm, which I certainly learned a lot by looking at that. Now, you noticed in your part of the world, as I noticed here, that this band was popular with football players. Your American football players and our Australian football players. It was really marketed towards, increase your sporting prowess, wasn't it?
Right. And what was funny was, no sooner had I gotten the video and the lecture together, and by the spring semester or maybe a year on, I wasn't seeing these things around as much. And I would kid my students. I would say, "Oh, it's because I gave such a convincing lecture that everyone, told their friends and neighbors, oh, it's all physics." Of course, I say this facetiously. The reason why I wasn't seeing them anymore was because when I first was introduced to them, it was the kids that could spend $30 on a plastic band. So it was the rich kids and it was the athletes. They were, there was an exclusive group. There was an exclusivity to these things. And then 6 months later, they were showing up I was living in Tupelo, Mississippi at the time. They were at the Tupelo flea market, 3 for $5, and everyone was wearing them. And that was the end of the fad. Because once they become ubiquitous, then there's nothing special about them.
That mirrors what happened here. I found a whole barrel full of them in the flea market myself one day.
And I missed out on it. As I was researching these, when I was originally coming up with the lecture, I did find a few folks on health and fitness blogs and such who were complaining, my band doesn't seem to be working anymore. So I'm not, and I missed out on the opportunity to invent the power balance band recharging station.
You could have done it. It might it might interest you to know that around the 2009, 2010, those bands were selling here in Australia for $60 each, and they sold quite a lot of them.
So in my, I'm not sure if in the web video, I think maybe the web version of my video, I don't include, it gives me a chance to talk about pyramid schemes as well.
All right.
Because there were some that were sold kind of in a pyramid, it's really tough to talk somebody out of $60 for a piece of plastic around their wrist.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to find your friends and family and convince them that this is a worthwhile product and get them to buy their stash of inventory. And then of course that percolates up to you. So it's a good way of introducing multi-level marketing schemes as well. You have my students, college-age students are all too often roped into MLMs of any number of varieties. So it's a good introduction to it.
Yeah, it's a classic of skepticism too, is our examination of all these multi-level marketing schemes over the years. Now, I noticed too that, this is ancient history in a way. I mean, this is all a decade ago that I did these tests and the power balance was very popular. But perusing TikTok not so long ago, I came across a woman selling a product which was insoles for your shoes. And the way she demonstrated it on her TikTok was the same sort of idea of these power balance. In other words, she had her subject stand there, and interestingly enough, she did it backwards. In other words, she had the product first, and she said, stand on the product and look how strong you are. Now step off the product. Oh, off the balance you go. And I sent it to you, and you could see, as I could see, that she's just applying her force differently.
Exactly right. Yeah. Once you know what to look for, and but it's so subtle, because even the guys that I videoed, they would have sworn to me, that they were doing it exactly the same way every time. Yeah. It wasn't until they saw the video that they were like, "Ooh, yeah." I would love to track those guys down and find out, a decade on, whether this was an impressive, whether this left any memory in their minds, as they were 18-year-old, 19-year-old, but whether or not such an exploration had any impact in their critical thinking skills. I've become much more explicit in the subsequent decade. This was kind of the start. It was indeed the first of my series. But now, just when things have kind of struck me that I think this would be an interesting exploration, and I would like to talk about confirmation bias with my students or something of the sort. I've created these little videos, which I deploy in class. It's not a critical thinking class. It's either a descriptive astronomy class or it's a physical science class, but it's a way of bringing skepticism to my non-science majors and essentially, teaching them about the scientific method, but without using those words. Because I think that especially these non-science majors, they think that, if it's they've heard the scientific method before somewhere in their educational background, but they think, you need to be wearing goggles and a white lab coat, for this to be important. I don't need to know this, but I'm trying to really impress upon them that skepticism, everyone should be applying skepticism in there. We all do in our daily lives. And I've become increasingly concerned, as you probably have as well, about this almost epidemic of certainty that we find in our world. All too often people are way out over their skis. Do you have that expression?
No, I don't know that one. That's an interesting one.
Way out, and actually it's a good center of gravity, or when you're way out over your skis, when you've got your weight way over your ski tips,
right,
and you're going to fall over.
Okay.
That's all too often. I think a lot of folks are overly confident in ideas.
Yes.
And don't have the skills to examine how those are founded. And so it's become part of my teaching mission, I suppose.
It sounds like a very human thing. It does. It sounds like a very human thing. We all get like that, I'm sure. I'm sure we do. And that's several of my videos are actually, and I've because I don't want to browbeat students, and I don't want to appear to be picking on students. So in many cases, I'm the patsy. I find things that I have taught wrong. In fact, last week I found a video
Veritasium is the channel.
Yes, a great series, Veritasium. Enjoy it very much.
Well, he's got a video about its energy does not travel in wires or something like that.
Fascinating.
It's exactly. And I watched that last week. I'd never seen it before. Saw it last week, and I was just finishing up teaching about electricity. And I realized, ooh, there's some sketchy things that I'm teaching. I need to re-examine, and that's great. And I came into class on Friday, and I told I showed him the video.
Yeah.
I said, I'm so excited because once you discover that you're wrong, you're not wrong anymore. And that's a very empowering kind of a feeling. And I won't teach it the same way. Next semester, those students will get a different product than what I put out this semester. And what I most love about the Veritasium video is, and near the end, he's talking with some other experts, and he says, how soon will it be till I get called out on this?
Yes.
And they're like, oh, you're going to get called out. And that's science.
That's science. That is. The other video I liked, really enjoyed, was the one where he sails faster than the wind. Have you seen that one? He's on
he's jibbing or whatever is what it's called.
He's on a land a land vehicle with wheels, and the vehicle is going faster than the wind is pushing or something. It's just fascinating. Right. Look, folks, I will link not only to the video about the power balance, which is very interesting, and as I said, I learned a lot about moment arm and torque and things like that, but a whole series that Bob has done on YouTube. And I would especially recommend all the teachers out there, science teachers, physics teachers, have a look. Have a look. I think you'll get a lot out of this. Well, Bob, thank you very much for sparing some time for the Skeptic Zone, and thank you for reaching out and sending me a note.
Oh, this has been a dream come true. I've wanted to get a chance to talk to you for a decade. Now I finally have.
Well, there you go. Right. Bob Swanson from the Department of Physics and Astronomy, Mississippi State University. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Hi, I'm Abhijit from the Rationable Podcast. We all have beliefs that we hold dear, like evolution is true, alternative medicine is quackery, and the ketogenic diet is a fad, and so on. But what if we were wrong? On the next Skeptics in the Pub, I'll be talking about 5 incidences where I tested my beliefs against the evidence and discovered that proving myself wrong was the right thing to do, and why, as skeptics, this is something we all need to do more in our lives. See you at Skeptics in the Pub on the 14th of April at 7 p.m. Sydney time and 2:30 p.m. Indian time to listen to my story.
Hello everyone, it's Adrienne Hill from Canada here to read the highlights from the Australian Skeptics newsletter. This is newsletter number 145. You can subscribe to this newsletter and get it delivered to your inbox every other week, complete with links to all these stories. Just visit www.skeptics.com.au. But now, let's get to the newsletter and see what Tim Mendham has lined up for us. Hi all, says Tim. Must have been a quieter fortnight as there are fewer items, though COVID maintains its presence. Worse luck. On the plus side, the anti-vax movement is apparently having hard times. And there's always the hybrid of psychic, astrology, and culinary arts to tickle your taste buds. Read on, Tim. Australia's anti-vaccine movement is collapsing. Crikey! Oh, I'm so happy to get to say this non-Canadian word. A Crikey article looks at Australia's anti-vaccine activists. Having seized on the COVID outbreaks as a rallying point, quote, the once energetic and active movement is now in trouble as their cause is falling apart, end quote. Key organizations are short of funds and taking desperate actions to build relevance. Man gets 87 COVID jabs in anti-vax fraud scheme. Authorities in Germany discovered a man had been visiting vaccine facilities 3 times a day as part of a suspected scheme to resell proof of vaccination to anti-vaxxers. Another indication of the high ethical standards and the low scientific literacy of that movement. Who is most likely to believe in the paranormal? A long article from Psychology Today tackles the question of why women are more likely than men to believe in supernatural phenomena. Is it that women are more empathetic than men, a trait that lends itself to belief, or at least the acceptance of the possibility of the paranormal? How wellness influencers became cheerleaders for Putin's war. Another long article, this one from Mother Jones, that pulls together online influencers promoting political views, QAnon supporters of Putin, quote, he is standing in the way of the global reset, end quote, and how unvaccinated people are far less likely to want to support the Ukraine in its battle with Russia. Pseudoscience of excited delirium. Never heard of that before. A New York-based advocacy organization, Physician for Human Rights, or PHR, has released a report on the lack of scientific grounding for excited delirium, which has been repeatedly cited as a cause of death in fatal police encounters. The very long report concludes that the term cannot be disentangled from its racist and unscientific origins. Gimbal UFO, a new analysis. UFO researcher Mick West has continued his investigations into perhaps the most popular and most cited video in support of alien craft, the Gimbal UFO. While the exact aircraft in question cannot be identified, there's simply no good reason to suspect it is of alien origin. It then makes you wonder why TV specials keep trotting it out as if it were still somehow evidence for alien spacecraft visiting our planet. The March 2022 issue of The Skeptic is out, and it features a look at the tics and tactics of high-level athletes to improve their performance, a combination of superstition and pseudoscience that is nonetheless very influential on fans and would-be champions. The issue also features articles on what exactly is Agenda 21, what do your own research entails, how a well-known critic of parapsychology had a change of heart, sort of, and much more. You can read that Tics and Tactics piece as a sample article from the March issue. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time to do so. Items of interest. Psychics cooking by the stars. Peter Marks, a, quote, world-renowned psychic medium, astrologer, intuitive, medium personality, and accomplished author, end quote, whom we have never heard of, has released the Gourmet Cookbook for astrology lovers. Recipes are tailored for each of the 12 different astrological signs. Poor old Ophicans go hungry, apparently. For example, Taurians are considered gourmet eaters because they have sensitive taste buds. A Libran loves sweets because of their rich, sugary texture. Was that the food or the person? A Sagittarius will try exotic dishes because of their daring and adventurous nature. And if you really want an amazing indication of the world-renowned psychic medium's intelligence and insight, quote, did you know that some of the world's best-known chefs are born under the sign of Cancer? End quote. And I'm betting that some of the worst probably are as well. Silliest story of the week. 16th century conquistador encountered by Pennsylvania deer hunter. I think maybe someone got seriously lost. That's all for now. Until next time, this is Adrienne Hill from sunny Canada, signing off.
Hola, les habla Paula desde la hermosa ciudad de Buenos Aires, en Argentina. Cuando escuchamos podcasts, escuchamos los mismos que escucha todo el mundo, como The Skeptic Zone. Ojalá puedan venir a visitarnos algún día. Los esperamos con nuestras riquísimas comidas locales y hasta podemos ir a bailar un tango. Mientras tanto, sigan disfrutando de su dosis semanal de ciencia y pensamiento racional. ¡Chao!
And now, a reading from the Book of Tim with Tim Mendham.
My name's Tim Mendham. I'm the editor of Australian Skeptics magazine, The Skeptic, and executive officer. And today I'll be reading an article from the Skeptic magazine from December 2013, which is volume 33, number 4. And this is an article written by Tim Harding, who's a regular correspondent with the magazine, and he's looking between the split between ancient astronomy and astrology, and that's how our view of the universe evolved. And he called this an eye to the sky. Today there are distinct boundaries between the modern science of astronomy and the pseudoscience known as astrology. But in ancient times these boundaries were not so clear. Both fields of study used a common set of astronomical observations, but for different purposes. The practical purposes of ancient astronomy were celestial navigation and the development of calendars of seasonal dates and events, such as the flooding of rivers for the planting of crops. In contrast, the purpose of astrology was to interpret celestial phenomena as signs of divine communications. Long before the invention of the telescope, ancient observations and predictions could only be of celestial objects visible to the naked eye. This restricted astronomical and astrological studies to the stars, the sun, the moon, and 5 planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The Earth was not counted as a planet until much later. In some locations, early cultures assemble some structures that are thought to have astronomical observations as one of their purposes. The best known of these structures is, of course, Stonehenge in Wiltshire, England, which commenced construction around 3100 BCE and went through several building phases. As there are no written records to go by, there are several theories as to various religions, mystical and other purposes of Stonehenge. One of these theories has been proposed by well-known Victorian skeptic Dr. Lynn Kelly. Cambridge University Press is publishing an academic book based on her PhD thesis about the use of structures like Stonehenge as mnemonic aids to ensure that the oral knowledge of the culture is retained and passed on to succeeding generations. Kelly is now writing another book on the topic for the general public, and for your information, since this article was published, those books are out and very worthwhile reading. The layout of Stonehenge also includes a celestial observatory function, which would have allowed the prediction of eclipses, solstice, equinox, and other celestial events important to a contemporary religion. One of the world's earliest known archaeoastronomical devices is a stone circle at Nabta, Playa, in southern Egypt on the Tropic of Capricorn. The site is between 6,000 and 6,500 years old, or about 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. 2 pairs of upright stones stand directly across the circle from each other, defining a view that would have marked sunrise at the summer solstice, thus providing the beginnings of a prehistoric calendar. The ancient Egyptian calendar year was 365 days long, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days at the end of the year. This was 1/4 of a day shorter than the solar year, leading to the problems of a wandering year, as it's called, requiring frequent astronomical correction. Observation of stars was important in predicting the annual flooding of the Nile for the allocation of resources to the planting of irrigated crops. Early Egyptian astronomy was intertwined with astrology. The sun was believed to be a major god named Ra, representing light, warmth and growth. Ra was thought to travel on 2 solar boats, one on his journey through the sky during the day, and the other in a river flowing underneath the flat Earth from west to east at night. So he went around in a circle. Most Egyptologists believe that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built as a tomb for 4th dynasty Egyptian pharaoh Khufu, also called Cheops or Cheops in Greek, over a 1,000 to 20-year period concluding around 2560 BCE, although other dates have been suggested. One theory is that this pyramid was carefully aligned towards the northern pole star, which at the time was Thuban, but is now Polaris due to the precession of the Earth's rotational axis. The ancient region known as Mesopotamia comprised the plains of the Tigris and Euphrates River in what is now Iraq, plus a bits of Syria, Turkey and Iran. The lower part between the rivers was known as Sumer, with Babylon, Uruk and Ur as its major cities. The significance of this region is that it was the cradle of astronomy and astrology as organised fields of study. Sumer was also the birthplace of writing in the form of cuneiform clay tablets dating from the mid-4th millennium BCE. These tablets provide us with the first written evidence of astronomy and astrology in the West, albeit in a fairly fragmentary nature. They're clay tablets, so they don't always survive well. From these tablets, we know that the Babylonians developed with a sexagesimal, which is base 60, numerical system, resulting in our current 60-minute hour, 24-hour day, and 360-degree circle. The Babylonians were the first to recognise that astronomical phenomena are periodic and to apply mathematics to their predictions. They developed the idea of a 7-day week and a 12-month calendar based on cycles of the moon, together with the seasons of summer and winter. The Babylonians also measured variations in the length of the day over a year. At around 1800 BC, the first star catalogues were compiled. The Babylonian astronomers noticed that a few stars, later called planets, wandered in relation to other fixed stars and even retrograded in their motions. These movements were confined to a narrow belt at an angle of about 23 degrees to the equator. This belt, called the zodiac, was divided into 12 sections, and each section was named after a constellation of fixed stars in the neighbourhood. The zodiac has also become one of the important features of Western astrology. We won't mention here Ophiuchus, which is actually the 13th sign in the zodiac, because that just stuffed everything up. In this early period, astronomy consisted of observations, calculations and predictions of events such as solstices and eclipses. As such, astronomy at this stage was like a branch of applied mathematics, plus a database of observations. There were no cosmological theories to tie all the observations and calculations together and try to rationally explain them. The explanation vacuum was instead filled by astrology, which claimed to interpret celestial events as religious or mystical omens. The Enuma Anu Enlil, in the days of the gods Anu and Enlil, which 1600 BCE, is a major series of 68 or 70 tablets dealing with Babylonian astrology. The number of tablets varies according to textual interpretations. It comprises a substantial collection of omens, estimated to number between 6,500 and 7,000, which interpret a wide variety of celestial and atmospheric phenomena in terms relevant to the king and state, known as mundane astrology, meaning the day, daily. For example, a typical astrological report to the king reads, "If the moon becomes visible on the first day, reliable speech. The land will be happy. If the day reaches its normal length, a reign of long days. If the moon, as its appearance, wears a crown, the king will reach the highest rank." Movements of the sun, moon and 5 planets were regarded as representing the activity of the gods in question. Evil celestial omens attached to any particular planet were therefore seen as indications of dissatisfaction or disturbance of the god that planet represented. During the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Babylonian astronomers developed a new theoretical approach to astronomy. They began to develop an internal logic within their observational data systems to improve their predictive power. This was an important contribution towards the development of astronomy from a database to a science. Some scholars have thus referred to this new approach as the first scientific revolution. The new scientific approach to astronomy was adopted and further developed in Greek astronomy. This process was considerably helped by the conquest of Babylon by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. According to the late classical philosopher Simplicius of Cilicia, 490 to 560 CE, Alexander ordered the translation of the Babylonian historical astronomical records under supervision of his chronicler Callisthenes of Olynthus, who sent them to his uncle Aristotle in Athens. Aristotle was also the teacher of Alexander until the age of 16. It's a small world. The name planet comes from the Greek term asta planetes, meaning wandering star. The names of individual planets within our solar system were drawn from Greek mythology, but were later Romanized outside Greece. References to identifiable stars and constellations appear in the writings of Homer and Hesiod in the 7th or 8th centuries BCE. However, the first Greek attempts to rationally explain the structure and behaviour of the cosmos date from the period 600 to 450 BCE. The anomalies in the motions of the planets bothered the early Greeks, who were culturally inclined to try to find rational physical explanations for them. Pythagoras of Samos, 570 to 495 BCE, was an Ionian Greek philosopher and mathematician who founded a philosophical movement known as the Pythagoreans. Astronomy was listed by the Pythagoreans among the 4 mathematical arts, along with arithmetic, geometry, and music. Herodiades of Pontus was a Pythagorean who lived in the 4th century BCE and studied under Plato. Heraclides held that the Earth rotated on its own axis, which accounted for the apparent procession of the stars across the night sky, but did not explain the retrograde motion of the planets. By now, these anomalous planetary motions had become the central problem of astronomy and cosmology. Plato encouraged Eudoxus of Cnidus, 410 to 347 BCE, to develop a 2-sphere model with the Earth at the centre and the planets occupying a separate sphere to the stars. Aristarchus of Samos, 310 to 230 BCE, has been called the Greek Copernicus because he proposed a heliocentric model of the cosmos, with the sun as the centre instead of the Earth, about 1800 years before Copernicus did, for which, of course, Copernicus suffered a bit at the hands of the Church. Aristarchus also calculated the sizes of the sun and the moon, as well as their distances from the Earth in Earth radii. Aristarchus' working drawings of the relative sizes of the sun, Earth, and the moon are illustrated in this issue of the Skeptic magazine. So if you go back to issue 33, number 4, page 31, you can actually see the illustrations that he developed. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, 276 to 195, or perhaps 194 BCE, mathematician, geographer, poet, astronomer, music theorist, and inventor of the word geography, calculated the circumference of the Earth by using a measuring system using stades, or the length of stadiums during that time period. Depending on which form of the stade he used, his calculation was between 1.6 and 16.4% off the actual distance. Unfortunately, Aristarchus was unable to persuade his contemporary colleagues of the merits of his theory, which was largely forgotten until rediscovered by Copernicus in the 16th century CE. Seleucus of Seleucia, born about 190 BC, was the only Greek Babylonian philosopher to support a heliocentric, sun-centred model of planetary motion. He also correctly theorised that tides were caused by the moon, a theory which was overlooked by Galileo 1700 years later. So in other words, the Greeks were actually developing a lot of these theories that we now accept a long time ago. They were dropped and revived later on. Hipparchus of Nicaea, 190 to 120 BCE, was a Greek astronomer, geographer, and mathematician of the Hellenistic period. He is considered the founder of trigonometry, but is most famous for his incidental discovery of precession of the equinoxes. He compiled a star catalogue recording the position and brightness of the stars, which was used by astronomers for centuries afterwards. As a result of the non-acceptance of Aristarchus' heliocentric model, subsequent Greek astronomers persisted with trying to reconcile the anomalous movements of the planets with a geocentric, Earth-centred model of the cosmos. Apollonius of Perga, 262 to 190 BCE, introduced 2 new mechanisms, the eccentric deferent and the epicycle. Now we get to one of the most important names in ancient astronomy, Claudius Ptolemy of Alexandria. He was a Greco-Roman mathematician, also known as an astronomer, geographer, and astrologer. Ptolemy explained how to predict the behaviour of the planets by introducing the equant. The basic elements of Ptolemaic cosmology indicate a planet rotating on an epicycle, which is itself rotating around a deferent inside a crystalline sphere. Starts getting complicated. The Earth is slightly off of the centre of this system. Opposite the Earth is an equant point, which is what the planetary deferent would actually rotate around. Ultimately, these attempts at retrofitting cosmological theory to seemingly endless observational anomalies just became too much. Dislike of the equant on top of the deferent and the epicycle was a major motivation for Copernicus to construct his heliocentric system after the scientific renaissance some 1,500 years later. Although astrology was not as popular in ancient Greece as it was in Egypt and Mesopotamia, belief in astrology continued through the Roman period and the Middle Ages. Through most of its history, astrology was considered a scholarly tradition. It was accepted in political and academic contexts and was connected with other studies such as astronomy, alchemy, meteorology, and medicine. At the end of the 17th century, new scientific concepts in astronomy and physics, such as heliocentrism and Newtonian mechanics, called astrology into question. Astrology thus lost its academic and theoretical standing, and common belief in astrology has since largely declined. And that's The Eye in the Sky from the Skeptic magazine, December 2013, Volume 33, Number 4. And you can read this article in full, as well as the entire issue of the magazine, and most other issues of the Skeptic magazine for free to download from our website, skeptics.com.au. Enjoy your reading.
Hi there, I'm Abhijit and I host the Rationable podcast on BeRationable.com. Every couple of weeks, I science the hell out of alternative medicines, health and nutrition fads, social media forwards, science news, and lots more. Of course, you can find all of my articles, podcast episodes, and lots more on www.berationable.com. See you there, and until then, always be rationable.
Time to dive back into the digital trove, the treasure trove of trove at trove.nla.gov.au. Of course, your online resource from the Australian Government and the National Library of Australia, digitised newspapers, gazettes, periodicals and magazines, and so on. And this week we're going to revisit a classic of skepticism, one of the big classics, one of the pillars of skepticism. I mean, I wonder what you could list, if you were to list the classical things that skeptics are skeptical of. Astrology would be in the top 5, I guess, from a historical point of view. Astrology, psychic powers, alien spaceships visiting Earth, ghosts. Yeah, astrology's really up there. In my way of thinking, I don't think you hear as much about it now as you used to. Hard to say. But there are certainly many articles about astrology in the pages of Australian newspapers and magazines and so on. Now, way back in 2020, I did a trove segment on astrology, which looked more or less at astrological predictions and the Second World War. But, there's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to picking items about astrology, and we turn to the South Coast Times and Wollongong Argus, dated the 27th of March, 1950. Astrology, a fake science. Taurus the Bull is Right by Phil Quine. Men at some time, masters of their fate, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves. So spake the shrewd but crafty Cassius, and he sure said something there. Brutus had just been ear-bashing him about what a big shot Julius Caesar was, and what small potatoes he and Cassius were in comparison, and it was then that the latter tartly reminded him that they only had themselves to blame. 350 years have elapsed since Shakespeare put those immortal words in the mouth of Cassius, and in that time not one recognized scientist anywhere in the world has expressed the slightest belief in any connection between the stars and man's destiny. Thousands of people are born every year on the same day, hundreds of them at the same hour, and yet how many of these people have the identical characters and personalities? Not one of them. There are not even any two people in the world with identical fingerprints. If there were, the entire fingerprinting system would automatically break down. And surely the mind and character of an individual is more intricate and complex than the patterns on the tips of his fingers. How could a planet, moving in its accustomed orb, hundreds of millions of miles away from Earth, have any possible bearing on the life of, say, Bill Jones of Sydney? Planets, after all, are only comprised of various gases and metals, and if a mass of metal or an accumulation of gas can influence a human being's life, it would be more logical for Bill to consult the Sydney Harbour Bridge or the gasworks before engaging in his daily affairs. Another screwy feature of the pseudoscience of astrology is that it places all its emphasis on the moment of birth. Bill Jones, for example, is born on April 22nd under Taurus, the bull. Surely an apt name for a sign of the zodiac. His cousin Tom Smith is born on April 18th, 4 days earlier, under Aries the ram. Tom's horoscope, and therefore his life, character, opportunities, etc., will be entirely different to Bill's. Yet the fact remains that both Bill and Tom may have been conceived on the same day. Surely, even if the stars did influence our lives, it would be more reasonable to assume that such influence would commence at the moment of conception, which is the true moment of birth, rather than at the time of delivery. Apparently, if a doctor hastens a birth by 24 hours to assist the mother, he is thereby changing the destiny of the world. Another thing that must disconcert followers of this particular faith is that even its most prominent messiahs cannot agree on the correct dates on which the zodiacal signs commence and finish. As I write, I have before me 2 astrology columns, culled from the current issues of 2 popular women's magazines. One says that Aries runs from March 21st to April 19th, and Taurus from April 20th to May 20th. The other gives Aries as March 21st to April 21st, with Taurus from April 22nd to May 21st. And so it goes, with the dates differing correspondingly in all other signs of the zodiac. A true believer whose birthday falls on one of the borderline dates may be pardoned a little natural confusion, especially as in one paper Taurus are going to have a successful week, and in the other they're doomed to meet with disappointments and difficulties. People who believe in astrology, and I am not speaking of those who read it lightly for its amusement value, but of the credulous simpletons who actually guide their lives by the trash, have the mentality of backwards morons. That's a little bit harsh. It is a moot point whether they should be protected from themselves by legislation or whether charlatans should be allowed to prey on them unhampered. But as one leading journalist said, when he asked if he really believed in astrology,
"I'll say I do. I get 20 quid a week for writing the muck."
So, yes, that was written by Phil Quine way back in 1950, and a little bit harsh, I think. And now we turn to a newspaper or a magazine at the time in 1941, the 17th of May. The journal is called Smith's Weekly, and apparently this ran from 1919 to 1950 here in Sydney. And it seems to take a similar hard line as the last item we read. Astrology is just all Taurus. It is a sheer impossibility to read the Australian Woman's Weekly and Sydney Sunday Telegraph, both of which come from the same office and have faith, if any, in astrology. And I don't see a byline, so this would be a staff writer or the editor, I imagine. Both these papers waste valuable newsprint on phony predictions. But gentle June Marsden, who fakes the future for the Woman's Weekly, and Barbara Thayer, Sunday Telegraph seer, can't agree on what the stars foretell. Marsden predicted for Sagittarius, born between November 24th and December 22nd, last week was not a spectacularly helpful time. Things can prove difficult for a few weeks. Barbara Thayer, most Sagittarians should enjoy a week of ease. This morning is the best time for starting new ventures. A week of ease is assured only to Barbara Thayer for being paid for fooling her puerile public. Old Olive Oil Stevens, of Woman, differed altogether with, "This week brings opportunities through your job." She means her job, which her dupes keep going. Of course, most nitwits can only afford one paper, and so are unaware of the tricks played on them. Preposterous June Marsden is at present sitting pretty, as is artful Arthur D. Dion. They both wax rich, contesting the position of, quote, biggest nut of them all, end quote. Each has a revolving line of sob stuff to churn out to catch mugs. And I'll just stop here. Mugs is an English, Australian term. It means a mark or a dupe or a fool, somebody who can be easily taken advantage of. We read on. Full of the milk of human kindness, they would have you believe them. Actually, they are both full of Taurus. Other Sunday, during one of her talks over 2GB, and 2GB is a radio station still, 2GB, sponsored by the Woman's Weekly, June told listeners that people had written to her saying that they wept with emotion at some of her stories. Poor boobs. "You must not cry," counselled June. "People who have passed from this life are hurt by our tears." But while her victims are here, June cashes in. She told a tale of her childhood. Once she thought she could fly, a symptom regarded seriously by doctors, jumped from a 2-story house, and flattened her nose. She did not admit to any other injuries, but in this fall there is probably some explanation for the bunkum she concocts. June claims to have made an important discovery. The bright star of the east, which led the shepherds to the infant Jesus, was, in reality, 3 big stars getting together for an important event. According to her, inside information, the 3 stars are going to get together again soon, although astronomers have their doubts. In Melbourne, boss cocky astrologer is J. Vickers Willis of Middle Brighton. He does a lively business in social circles. By shaking a hand at a cocktail party, he has been able to tell the owner of the hand that he would have to watch out for kidney trouble. A long horoscope concocted by Vickers Willis some time ago for a young man now earning distinction with the RAAF, that's the Royal Australian Air Force, overseas, has been handed to Smiths. Seer told him that he would lose rather than gain if he travelled within 2 years after the horoscope was cast, and warned him against having anything to do with the air. The young man borrowed some money and went overseas. Immediately he obtained an excellent job, far better than any he had had in Australia. Within a year he had paid off the loan. When war broke out, he returned to Australia and was immediately accepted by the RAAF. He is now overseas and has an excellent record in the air. Explanation for the failure of Vickers Willis forecasts is surely that the young man did not supply the exact hour of his birth. Not one scientist of standing has any kind of word for astrology. It is a wicked ramp designed to fleece the superstitious and ignorant, or both. Federal and state governments should declare the practice of astrology criminal. Strong words, again. Wow, very strong words from way back in, when was it, 1941? We heard about a woman called June Marsden, who was an astrologer in the Australian Woman's Weekly. And so I did a little research, and here's an excerpt from 1940, the 23rd of March, from the Australian Woman's Weekly, written in the stars. Astrology by June Marsden. President, Australian Astrological Research Society. March 21 is an important date. It ushers in the astrological year. Well, I didn't know that. Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, and people born between March 21 and April 21 belong to the ranks of a race extraordinary. True to their sign, the first in the zodiac, they are pioneers and like to lead others and to break into new and sometimes difficult or dangerous fields of endeavour, in the preference to leading a life of even partial monotony. Astrology endows this sign with the symbol of Aries, the ram, and this gives the indication of the main characteristics of Arians. Just as the ram takes pride in his position as head of the herd and enjoys bossing things in a lordly manner, so do Arians crave authority and independence, accountable to none, and to secure positions to boss others around when the mood or occasion demands. So there you go. I won't read on. It goes on. There you go, people who consider themselves Aries. Look out. I bet you didn't know that, or maybe you did. And right at the bottom of the article it says, the Australian Woman's Weekly presents this series of articles on astrology as a matter of interest, without accepting responsibility for the statements contained in them. June Marsden regrets that she is unable to answer any letters. Editor, Australian Woman's Weekly. Of course, there are many hundreds, if not thousands or more, items and articles and bits and pieces concerning astrology over the decades. But you might have a bit of fun looking up some of those for yourself if you visit Trove at trove.nla.gov.au. And you never know what you might find. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone. And as you heard in the Skeptic Zone, my friend Abhijit Chanda from India will be presenting at Skeptics in the Pub here in Sydney this Thursday night, Australian time. And you can just follow the link in this week's show notes. Or if you go to Twitch, twitch.com/Australian Skeptics. That's the place to go, and you can see Abhijit give his talk, and I will be hosting that event. Looking forward to that a great deal. And also, if you go to skepticzone.tv, go to the top of the page, you'll see a link for TikTok, because the Skeptic Zone is also on TikTok with a series called Mystic Minute, where I look at various paranormal and supernatural claims very briefly, just give a very brief overview. And for some reason, the latest one I put up there, all about spoon bending, has got more hits than any other. Spoon bending, eh? If you want to see me bend a spoon, head to skepticzone.tv and click the TikTok link. Or indeed, if you are on TikTok, if you're a TikToker, why not subscribe to my TikTok channel? But now it's time for me to run downstairs and have a large drink of water, I think. I don't know what's happening to my voice today. Oh well. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian Skeptics or any other skeptical organisation.